You can access the entire episode now on our website, forbiddenknowledge.news, Rokfin, Rumble, and all podcast platforms. Let's go through some of the big chapters and some of the most integral parts of this event, starting with the first chapter. You write a lot about Oswald. I know we've gone over Oswald in depth over the episodes, but is there anything in particular that stands out or even new information that you've included recently?
Not so much with Oswald as it pertains to this book. The more interesting stuff that I've come across really had nothing to do with Oswald, and I'll give you an example. And this is something that's been around forever because the David Ferry documents have been around since at least 1994. So we've had since 1994 for people to discern this information and find some relevance to it. But as it turns out, everyone always calls David Ferry a homosexual because he was banging dudes, right? And so, but the reality was, I came across documents showing that he was married in 1949, obviously to a woman. He had 2 dependents when he was living in Tampa, and Eastern Airlines, in the course of their investigation, uncovered the name David Ferry Jr., who was a lieutenant in the Marine Corps in 1963. So it seems as though David Ferry was married and had a child at some point, but by 1963, they were estranged, or seemingly estranged, because Eastern Airlines, they had been set up on David Ferry because there were allegations that he was doing unethical things, right? He was being accused of doing homosexual stuff in the airplanes and whatnot, and using the airplanes for non-official usage. But when they go digging into him and they find out about this David Ferry Jr., one of the ways they found out about David Ferry Jr. was because the license plate of a vehicle that was parked at David Ferry's house one night. So obviously in 1963 or 62, David Ferry was in contact with his own son. This has never before ever been talked about in Kennedy research ever. No one's ever mentioned this fact. This is, to me, is just one example of many of how the relevant data to kind of understand the characters in the assassination has been out there forever, and to this very day still being overlooked. I don't understand what's going on here. Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me how some of the things that I concluded and came to the realization of were very basic, and people should have come to those realizations a long time ago. And this is where I have like a big kind of gripe with the JFK research community as a whole.
No offense to gay people at all, but it seems like you have to have a little bit of gayness to get into these upper ranks and the upper echelon of these 3-letter agencies and government ranks. So just keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, if you are looking to enter that world.
Well, in the 1950s and 60s, they saw that as a method of either blackmail or that those people were easily controllable for one reason or another. And so that's why when you get into these groups, you find all this weird gay shit going on, because those people were brought in specifically for their ability to be manipulated.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of, it's really strange, because like everywhere you turn, everyone's gay. It's fucking weird. Like Johnson had like 3 gay dudes in his administration get caught. You know what I mean? It was like, what? It's just strange. It's like, what the fuck's going on here?
Now, the next chapter you write about is Ferry and then Carrie Thornley.
Right.
And Carrie Thornley's an interesting cat in general during that period, right?
Yeah, because like, so I don't, here's the thing. No matter how much study I do into the CIA, I don't, and I understand their underlying missions and all that stuff, I don't understand what makes them do some of the weird shit. Like Kerry Thornley, after the Kennedy assassination, he got involved with and became like the pioneer of what's called Discordianism, which was a stupid post-hippie kind of weird I don't know. It's like it's somewhere between the hippie era and the disco era of philosophy, and it kind of fell back on somewhat like a paganistic, naturalistic kind of ideology. But at the same time, it was a nonsensical fucking CIA experiment that he was the grand leader of. He had a fucking alias, Omar fucking something, Omar Blackbird or something. It was some crazy CIA nonsense, right? So anytime I think of Kerry Thornley, I think of that weird shit. And like, he did interviews, and this is the fascinating thing about Kerry Thornley. Kerry Thornley later did interviews, and he talked about how he was involved in a conspiracy to kill the president, but Oswald beat him to it. I swear to God, these are the words that came out of his mouth. This guy Like, books have been written on Kerry Thornley, but no one's written the definitive book on him, and somebody needs to do that one day. It ain't going to be me. The guy pisses me off far too much when I read his. The guy is he thinks he's one of these people who like thinks he's smarter than he really is, right? When you go through the Kerry Thornley files and Jim Garrison papers, what you'll find is that in the midst of the stack of papers on Thornley, there is a 50-page affidavit that Thornley wrote sometime in the 1970s for Jim Garrison. Because even though Clay Shaw's trial ended in 1969, Jim Garrison continued the investigation for like another 7-8 years after that. So a lot of information came in after the fact. But basically, Kerry Thornley wrote an affidavit, and in that affidavit, I perceive it as a confession. Because he associates himself with every single fucking conspirator there is, from Guy Bannister to Clay Shaw to David Ferry, you name Martin McAuliffe, Sergio Arcacha, Lawrence Howard. He connects Oswald, obviously. He connects himself to all the fucking players in the assassination, and he's like, it's amazing. All these people around me were seemingly involved, but I had nothing to do with it. It was like, what are you doing? Right? So when you go through that, you'll find a lot of things. He confesses to having met Marcello. He confesses that, but he phrases it in such a way where it doesn't seem like a confession, but it is. He tells Jim Garrison things like, I did a FOIA request to the Naval Intelligence trying to get documents on myself and on Oswald, and they told me they didn't have anything. And he tells Jim Garrison it's highly suspect that they didn't have anything on me and Oswald at the time when I requested them. So what is he really saying there? What he's really saying is he's confessing to Jim Garrison that we work for Naval Intelligence and they should have documents, but they're saying they don't. Okay? So when you go through his affidavit, that is exactly how it reads. It completely and totally reads like he's confessing without confessing. There's even one part where he allegedly meets two people. One named Slim Brooks and the other named Gary Kirsten, aka brother-in-law. Now, brother-in-law allegedly is E. Howard Hunt. Okay, but that's a whole other conversation. We'll just put that aside for now. So, brother-in-law, he says, constantly roped him into conversations, philosophical conversations, political ones. And he was roped several times into conversations about killing Kennedy. And this is all theoretical, right? They're having these theoretical conversations about killing Kennedy. And then at one part he says, well, who do we frame for it? And then he goes on and he talks to Jim Garrison. He writes this whole page out about how Gary Kirsten said he would frame some convict because convicts are always guilty or something like that. And then Kerry Thornley says that he suggests to Gary Kirsten, aka brother-in-law, that we should frame a communist for it. Okay? So again, he's confessing to Jim Garrison without confessing. He's telling a story that everyone around him is involved in this conspiracy except for him, right? So, of course, Gary Kirsten and brother-in-law, we don't even know if these are real fucking people, right? So he could have just made this completely up. But he acknowledges, and then later he goes on like hard copy in like the 1990s, and he straight up says, I was involved in a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, but Lee Oswald beat me to it. Straight up says that. Like, it's crazy. This fucking guy is such an idiot. Like, he's the dumbest person ever who walks around thinking that he's fucking smart. He died like 20 years ago. Like, I don't even know what killed him, but yes. So I go into detail in how full of shit Kerry Thornley is and how Kerry Thornley was really more of a mastermind of things, because there's a lot of incidents where there are aliases used for Oswald, like Alec Heidel, and also the alias of Osborne. And so when you dig into Oswald's background and where those aliases came from, well, you discover Oswald never actually used those aliases. Those were used for him by Marina and by Kerry Thornley, who were using them to set him up. And those names that were chosen, Heidel and Osborne, happened to be names of people who were in the Marines with Oswald in his squadron unit number 1. Well, Kerry Thornley wouldn't have known those names. But Kerry Thornley admits to Jim Garrison that he had a, quote, handler named Bud Simcoe, and that Bud Simcoe knew Oswald in squadron number 1.